Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a virtual studio visit with artist Deirdre Murphy. My name's John Thompson. I'm Associate Teaching Professor of Art and the Art Gallery Director here at Penn State Abington. And I'm pleased to introduce what is sure to be an exciting and interesting illustration of what artistic and scientific collaboration looks like. Deirdre Murphy's recent work has examined avian migratory patterns and how they've been impacted by light pollution and climate change. Her work recently shifted to also include nest building. Deirdre's work stems from a deep creative curiosity in the natural world, which has led to many collaborations with scientists and institutions such as Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Powder Mill Nature Reserve, Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and Drexel University's Academy of Natural Science and Integral Molecular Laboratory. Murphy earned her MFA from the University of Pennsylvania and her BFA degree from Kansas City Art Institute. She's a visiting assistant professor at Lehigh University and is taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Drexel University, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. To provide scientific context, we're also joined in conversation by our resident ornithologist, Dr. Les Murray, Associate Professor of Biology at Penn State Abington. Mary's research is field-based and investigates the relationship between bird populations and their environment. We'll join this presentation already in progress, followed by a Q&A with the audience.
You know, coming into your lab, Les, I would, the thing that links you and I together is that we're both visual thinkers. We're both curious, being artists and scientists. Your work is field-based research, and I have to say that mine is as well. And so this interest of mine with bird and bird migration and climate change has been the bulk of my work for the last 15 years. But then with quarantine, it shifted to nests. And so the questions that I have that I'm really excited to learn about from you today are, why do they build the nests? Is it just for reproduction? Are nests a home? How do they engineer their homes? What type of nests are there? From ground nest to tree nest to platform nests, and just kind of learning from you about this idea of nests, which is completely new to me. And to give you all a little bit of backstory, my work, so the painting on the right is Spring Jewel, and so I'm primarily an oil painter. And these goldfinch were literally just from a park that's right by my house, and I'm an avid gardener and plant native species and pollinators and really try and attract the songbirds. But I'm using data in this painting. You can see if I move my cursor here, like this is the Atlantic Flyway. Going up to around Cape May here, and it kind of looks like Mardi Gras beads. And, it's this kind of delightful, joyous, color palette. But I'm looking at how, the migratory flight path is changing with climate change. And I'm looking at scientific graphs and meeting with scientists like in order to discern how these patterns are changing, and then how I can visualize this data to make paintings, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm really interested in, is to make paintings. But the meaning and the content behind the paintings is definitely where the collaborative comes into play with working with scientists. Love Audubon and naturalists, from days gone past to naturalists present. And so I think, naturalists being, having a kinship with science. I was doing paintings based on naturalists' illustrations, or looking at Audubon. So I've studied Audubon for a good many years. And so this, with the cedar waxwing, Winds of Change is the name of this one. And again, looking at climate change and how these red lines here were actually from an airport when the airplanes are coming in. I was just waiting for a plane, when we used to be able to travel. And I looked at the, what we would say are our human flight patterns. And so I incorporated those in. And then, of course, planes being dangerous to birds and things like that, keeping that in mind. So just more examples of how I've worked with this idea of bird migration. This one is dealing with how birds see. So the colorful section inside this lyrical looping where you have all these color shards, that's a nod to my, thimbleful of understanding humbly about how birds see, and that they actually, because they see, or some species see ultraviolet, they actually see a lot more than we do. Um, Unless I'm sure you can explain that to us. But the one, for our every color, one red that we can see, birds supposedly can see 50, or at least that's what I've been told. And so that just blows my mind that these creatures are not bird-brained, as in simpleton at all. They're actually exquisitely sophisticated. So more of like the climate change paintings here. So there's no birds, but the birds are symbolized by these triangle shapes that are all hand taped and painted. And so this is an interest in murmurations, or that kind of flocking pattern that I have. And so I'm still alluding to birds, but not painting them literally. And then sometimes I do murals. This is with Dickinson College. So the bird here is it's a census data on at Dickinson. They were doing census data on what birds existed in the 1800s versus what birds exist today at Carlisle, PA. And then I coded each of the birds with a different color, and the students helped me to paint them in. And then the red and the green dots are the breeding and feeding of the different species. And then this is the Conneduguanet creek that runs through Carlisle, and they're also looking at phosphate and nitrate levels, it being pretty polluted, that of course affecting the birds. So that's some data there. And then light pollution maps, that came into play actually working. I had a bioart residency. So the previous work was with Hawk Mountain up in Kempton, PA, and then Powder Mill, which is part of Carnegie Museum of Natural History and the Academy of Natural Science in Philly. This work here, the light pollution map, was actually looking at viruses under the microscope and trying to visualize the molecular biology data. And what I saw when a virus transfects, or, the proteins, and they're looking for, vaccines to cure, Ebola and dengue is what I was looking at. Now, these same scientists at Integral Molecular are looking at COVID-19, of course, but when they're studying these viruses, it looked like light pollution maps. And so I made these paintings that tied in light pollution maps and this idea of when songbirds migrate at night, the light pollution, it really can wreak havoc on their journey, and they can go off track. They can fly into windows on buildings. So there's a lot of kind of human-made perils that these songbirds have to overcome. And so the light pollution map is in this painting that's on view now in a show in Pittsburgh. And then you can see the Milky Way, because the birds are amazing. The songbirds, they fly with different constellations. So you're going to see a lot of constellations in my work, because that's their GPS system, or so I understand. So this is just more paintings that talk about songbirds and migratory data. You can see that North and South America in here. And then the Milky Way kind of turns into these dendritic arms of, this is me musing about cells, and then the cells turn into dots, which are the stars. So it's kind of like, everything, with that speck idea, or the dot. And then that brings me to my very current work that I just finished, which is part of the Threshold exhibition in Pittsburgh. So we still have the circle and the dot, whether it be a microscope lens or a telescope lens. But now, this is the pandemic that we're in. This is the beginning of the pandemic. And I would go on walks and just trying to be alone. I'd have to go early in the morning. And of course, I'd hear the birds. This was March, right? So the birds are just starting to migrate back, and I'm seeing the songbirds in the kind of architecture of the trees in the forest. And I'm waiting for the warblers to return and the goldfinch to return and the thrushes. And I found that, living in Philly, a lot of the places I would go to were too populated, and I was scared to go there even with masks because it was the beginning of the pandemic. And so I went to these storm drains, these storm culverts that kind of look like sewers, but they had this great graffiti inside. So it reminded me of the caves of Lascaux. And I would sit inside these storm drains and I would paint. And this is like 40 by 40 inches. There's another one. This is the other end of the culvert. And all the while, the warblers were there and they were coming out and they were, it was like nature was resilient. Here we are in this pandemic and it's so scary and depressing and so, filled with anxiety. But yet nature is resilient. And so thus these paintings, these plein air paintings, I call them my pandemic plein air because I was, feeling so anxious and looking for a place to just kind of be and respond to nature. And nature provided. She came right back, and spring was all around, and the warblers came back, and they started to roost and nest and all that. So I realized, you know what, we're gonna get through this. We've been through this before as a species. Nature is resilient, and so is humanity. And so this is the show that's up right now. It's got, I think, one more week. It comes down November 6th. So if you're going to Pittsburgh, check it out. Oh, there's my cave. Yes. So this is the tunnel that I painted in, which is what made me see all these nests, which is why we're here today. And there's my kids trekking with me to find these odd sites. So here's the nests, and these are, I apologize for my lousy photos. This is just me walking in the mornings, looking for subject matter. So just like Les does field-based research, so do I. And at the same time that I was taking these walks in from, March to present, but you'll see the architecture of the trees because it's, the end of winter, beginning of spring. And at that time, I am co-teaching a class with Dr. Jennifer Swan at Lehigh University on the neuroanatomy of the brain. And she's teaching about neurons. And I see these neurons as neuron nests in the tree. And there's my hook. I think, oh my goodness, neurons are these amazingly complicated, just convoluted forms. And they're so sophisticated and they're so simple and they're just phenomenal. And they remind me of bird nests. And I thought, well, why have I never looked into bird nests before? This is crazy. This is my new threshold. This is my new interest. And so then I looked at artists, scientists like Ramoni Cajal, who did these incredible drawings of neurons, and they looked like tree forms to me and plant forms. And so then I started drawing these bird nests that I would find. And so as I'm drawing them and I'm walking around, I'm thinking about nest engineering and how do they do this and how smart are they? This is just amazing. And here I am stuck at home, and a nest is a home. And nests are at once incredibly vulnerable because birds can fly away whenever they want, but the nests are like these amalgamations of these sticks that are just stuck together, sometimes with mud, but sometimes just compression and tension, and they're really vulnerable. And I feel really vulnerable. We all do, and we're stuck at home, yet we want to be at home, but we're, it's just this quarantine feeling. And there's the strength in the birds building their nests wherever they want to. But then there's that vulnerability. So that's the dichotomy that drew me to really, today. And so here's a photo on the right, and then this is me musing about it, doing a little, acrylic on paper. So these are just like preliminary studies for me. And then the brooding begins. So the birds start laying their eggs, and it's the leaves are coming out in the tree. And, so these are all going to be potential paintings in the future, or they're going to be, um, prints. So we'll see. But you can see her little tail feather, the robin sticking out there. So I had to get her in there. And that idea of vulnerability and strength coming up. And then, oh, here we go. Les, this is you. Look at this. Can you tell us about this? This
This
is,
is a nest of a veery. So it's closely related to a robin. So you see the same blue color of the eggs.
yeah.
So it's a thrush species. This was taken by a colleague of mine who was using these infrared cameras to look at nest predators. And I'm blanking on the name of the state park that this is in, but it's in northeastern Pennsylvania. And so we were interested in what species of predators would potentially impact these veery nests. And so my colleague Chris was finding a bunch of these nests, and so we put these cameras on, and what we found is that basically every predator you could imagine is coming to these nests. And that's what we find more and more, is that these nests really are vulnerable to predation from so many different species.
So you're looking at vulnerability from that angle of predation.
Yes.
What is this nest made of? What's this outside part? I'm sorry, what is this outside? Are those leaves or
Yeah,
what?
those are dried leaves that they're picking up off the ground.
And then how far off the ground is this?
Not very far. Probably less than 2 feet for sure.
Okay.
Um,
Do you think someday I might be able to go on a field visit with you and actually, just kind of be your shadow and find these nests with you?
yeah, we can take a trip some spring and find some place
That would be
to go
incredible.
find some of these nests, but it's not always as easy as you hope it would be.
Well, that's the thing, because it's like the tree nests are one thing, right? Like this one here, I found on a walk, and it was, I don't know what raptor, unless you probably know, but it was way up high in a tree that got hit by lightning, and so it snapped over in half. And I thought this nest is just like a disordered stick bomb. I don't know how it's staying together, but it is, even though it's even fallen over. And this thing was massive. It was like probably 4 foot in diameter. But that's like seeing this, and I wanted to take it with, and I'm actually glad I didn't, because I was going to come back one night and saw it off and bring it home. But then like the next week it had blossomed into nothing but poison ivy. And I was like, oh my God, I would have been covered in blisters. But I thought like seeing this nest made me think like, wow, like nests are all around. I just don't see them because they're not eye level. This one was high in the treetop. But like, what's the mechanics behind this, and how do they do these? How do they make these? Here's another one of your photos.
Yeah, so that's the female veery sitting on the nest, and so you see the cameras we can get a lot of information about the behavior of the adults, as well as far as their interactions with predators when the predators do come to the nest. Most of the time they'll fly away, but we do have video of them successfully defending the nest as well. So we get this behavior of protection of the young that increases as the young get older, as the investment of the adults. The previous investment of the adults has increased. They've spent a week or more, 10 days incubating eggs, another time feeding these young. Their vigilance and protection of the young actually increases as the young get older, because of that investment that they've already made.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, sorry. Then this is just this is just kind of some studies. This is how I start out my practice, Les. So like if I would be able to go on a walk with you and, a field trip, then I would, literally a field trip. I would, bring my sketchbook, and I would so these are nests that have fallen out of trees that I've found. I would love to find some more nests. Like I always feel apprehensive about like don't want to take a nest out of a tree, because that's actually a question I had for you, Les, was do birds go back to the same nests year after year, or do they, like, I find some nests that just degrade in the rain, and then overnight they're just a lump of like mud on the ground.
It depends on the species.
Okay.
Things like raptors typically will reuse them,
Okay.
right? So you think of a bald eagle nest, it's going to be like 6 feet wide, like 4 feet tall, huge sticks, and so rebuilding those every year or every couple of years is not really feasible. So they'll reuse them year after year. Species that nest in, say, cavities may reuse, and in trees may reuse those. But generally, the nests like these ones, they're not going to make it
Okay.
through. And then migratory birds are not necessarily going to come back exactly to the same place
Okay.
or be able to reestablish in that same territory as well.
Okay.
So there are a few birds that will reuse it. For the most part, they're remaking most of their nests, especially the smaller species.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. I loved this photo. Can you talk about what this photo is?
So here are a sampling of some of our predators from this study in northeastern Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned before, we basically everything. We don't have a cat pictured here, but we have our fox in the top left. We have a weasel in the bottom left, which is actually one of our more frequent nest predators,
Hmm.
at least during 1 year. So we don't know if it was just a random effect, or if their populations were higher, or if their other food sources were lower. We're not really sure what was going on there, but we did have a lot of weasels. We've got our barred owl on the right, a snake in the top right. We had fewer than those than we expected as well. And then we had a couple visits from the black bear, which is the one in the center.
Yeah. And then was
Which
this a ground nest, or was this a lower?
most of these nests were lower to the ground. So these were all veery nests. They're typically going to nest either on the ground or to around 2 or 3 feet above the ground. So we think that did contribute to how many different predator species we saw, because they're accessible. Where if they were in a tree, it's going to limit the number of predator species that can access it.
Got it. Okay.
And so ground nesting birds typically have the lowest nest success
Yeah.
of any group of birds. Yeah.
Which is like, why? That's another question. Then why would they nest so low? Why wouldn't they put their nests high? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are some advantages to it as far as hiding the nest.
Hmm.
Generally, you have a lot thicker vegetation, like in grasses and those kinds of things.
Okay.
Some of them use habitats where trees are not available,
Oh,
right?
sure. Yeah.
So the small shrubs in the ground are the only place to really nest.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this gives you an idea of just, how like the beginnings of my process, and how, I'll take those photos. I'll either bring my sketchbook out in the field with me, which this one would be, and then I would bring, those photos and my sketches back to studio. And here is the beginning of a wood carving. And then this one, is really neat. This like tree just got chopped off, and there was a little nest in here, but then there's also a platform nest on top. It was really neat. So this one will become a little etching. So that's how, and then, hopefully, hopefully they'll become, paintings in the future. Um, Sculpting made me think about different artists that use this idea of nest structure. And of course, John, I thought of Buckminster Fuller with the tensegrity sculptures, with having, I don't know, I've never built one, but my husband Scott White, who I collaborate with, has made these tensegrity sculptures, and which look like nests to me, and are built with that same kind of compression and tension, like no glue, no hardware, just sticks under tension, basically. And so who knows, maybe we'll make a tensegrity sculpture based on nest research. I'm sorry, my cursor keeps flipping. And then I was looking at architects that, did this whole idea of building off of the nest structure. So of course the Beijing National Stadium came to mind. So, when I'm doing my own field work research, I'm also looking at different artists that also, will do research in similar area. It's kind of like how I begin my process. Um, and then, from what, the work that we'll do together, Les, and then just the, my kind of, my own research, then Scott and I will, at some point in time in the future, once COVID lifts, we'll have a collaborative exhibition at the Penn State Abington Gallery. And this is one of our collaborative sculptures. So Scott White being my husband and my collaborative partner, I drew this pattern on this aluminum hand-shaped dome that he made. And so I drew the constellation pattern of the, let's see, this one is the spring migration. So you've got Cassiopeia and Ursa Major and Minor, Polaris. So I put the constellations by which some of the songbirds migrate. And then we literally drilled like 1 million holes, and then it's lit from within. And this is actually on view at the Charles Library at Temple University. It's in their brand new library in one of the study floors. So who knows what's going to come of the bird nests. And then this one, just to kind of end this as a thank you, but also to show you like how, the nests are, I'm going to find the nests in these trees, and then this is an example of a painting that's on view at Box Heart right now through November 6th. And even though it doesn't have a nest in it yet, and it doesn't have literal birds, it has these, these patterns here are data visualization of songbirds migrating at night in the autumn. So that's kind of gives you an overview of where I've come and then where I'm hopefully headed. So we can entertain any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Deirdre. It's great to see an introduction on an artist's work, and it's also fun to see the progression that the work takes as it kind of follows your interests, where like you talk about micro and macro systems. And it was really interesting to see the way that there's kind of like this macro system of the migration, and you were showing lines in there, almost like map lines. And then those lines, you can see how they started to translate just formally into the lines that you see in nests as
Yeah.
a bird is building that. So I talk, one of my foundation 2D classes is here now, and I talk a lot about how important these like fundamental elements, like such as line are, and how much it's used throughout your work. So that's really interesting.
Absolutely. I come back to those core design elements all the time, those principles and elements of design, of line and shape and color and all. It's just, yeah, it's always present, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I see that we have some questions coming in, so we do want to open things up. We've got about 20 minutes left, so if anyone has questions for Deirdre and or Les, please include them in the chat. I have some coming up here. Also, if you want to ask your question verbally, just kind of like do a virtual hand raise, and we'll get to everyone that we possibly can. There's a question from Dan Oliva, who kind of came in first and has a great question for both Deirdre and Les. So I'm going to ask you to unmute for your question.
Okay, cool. Thanks, John. This is really wonderful. And thank you, Deirdre and Dr. Murray, for doing this talk. I'm really glad that I could be here for this. And plus, like, it's just so interesting to see the progression of your work and all your sketches, because I think it's just a good reminder for artists to see how all the work develops. But my question is for both of you, and I guess it would be in two parts. It's about climate change and the current era that we're in, which I think is, I could broadly describe as like a sort of panicky time regarding climate change, where we feel like we need to know, in a sense, what's going on with climate change. And so data visualization seems to become a very important part of that. And with the naturalism that you've stated as sort of your traditional, the heritage that you draw from, like Audubon, Deirdre, your work seems to include so much data viz that's so interesting, because it seems, I'd love if you could talk about whether that helps us understand it in a way that is maybe a bigger perspective, and maybe that's different from what people felt they needed to know when they were looking at Audubon's work versus today, this age, and your work. And maybe for Dr. Murray, that question might be, how can we understand how climate change is affecting bird, migrations and stuff like that? I don't know if that's clear.
Wow. Awesome questions, Dan. So nice of you to be here. It's great to hear your voice. Thank you so much. So, I mean, I think with the data visualization, that, and it kind of ties in really nicely with your observation, John, about the principles and elements of design and how foundational they are and how important they are, no matter what point in your career, whether you're in a foundation class or you're 30 years into your professional art career. And so I looked at the way that scientists communicate visually, and it's through data typically, where they're presenting papers with graphs and charts, and so I was looking at those graphs and the different illustrations or images that accompanied their papers and research, and they look like abstract drawings to me, Dan. Some of them were just like breathtakingly beautiful, and I thought, wow, and these are really compelling design images, and then behind them is really important research about climate change. And so that helped me to kind of dig deeper into the content, because it's like form follows function. And so the design elements of the painting, be they dots or lines, or shape, they need to be arranged in such a way that are, for me, exquisitely beautiful. Like the painting has to be incredibly well crafted and made, and very well thought out. But then the content, the meaning, the message needs to be there too, because I don't want to just make beautiful images, or it's like you just don't want to make just a pretty picture kind of thing. Like for me, it has to have this idea of both artistic investigation, but then there has to be a content investigation, and so that's why the data visualization is important to me, because it's my way of hooking into the scientist mind through pictures, of course. And then that helps me to get deeper into my own research that, like with today, this is a perfect example of, literally I would be in Dr. Murray's lab right now if I could, and I'd be looking at his artifacts and findings. But this is, the whole idea of the bird nests, this is completely new territory for me, and I need to be schooled. I need to learn. And so that's where I go to the experts, I go to the ornithologist, and which is Les right here.
So I mean, I'll build off of that, and then I'll try and get to your question about kind of how do we research these patterns. But one of the things that I found interesting was when she was talking about looking at this data and and what's behind that data. And then I was thinking about what's really behind that data is a lot of objective opinions about how valuable some of the bird populations are and how much of an impact this has. But from a scientific lens, we try to be as objective as possible. And no matter how we visualize that data, we generally restrict it down to one objective statistical test that gives us a few values that we use to determine if there's really anything there worth looking at. And so to see people take the data and make it something more I think is good and important and effective. So I teach a climate change class here at Abington, and it has an art component to it. It's one of those
Oh,
linked
cool.
courses, the new linked courses. And I'm by no means an artist. Yvonne Murphy Love and I have had a lot of conversations about this before. But one of the things I point out to my students is that emotion is generally what gets people to take action. So as far as scientists figuring out the effects of climate change, there's ways to do that. And we do that. But what becomes the hard part is connecting with people in a way that they recognize that that's something that needs to be acted on, and not just a boring scientific article that comes down to statistical analyses, right? We need an objective way to figure that out, but we need to make that next step as far as interacting with other people and getting that information to be used in an effective way. And so I think that's where that connection is starting to be made. I've only taught the class once, but even in that one semester, when I really started to think about it, I started to realize the value a lot more. So hopefully my students picked up on that as well, I hope.
Awesome. I want to take that class. Sounds great.
So we have a question kind of in the same vein. David Ruth asked, given the dramatic drops in bird populations, Deirdre, do you see your work as being about loss, and how does that affect the work?
Wow, that's a really good point. I was thinking about the songbird loss. That it's one of my questions for Les too, was recently. So yes, there is definitely a feeling of loss of or just like this heightened kind of awareness and wanting to kind of shake people up, but doing it instead of, I found through social activism, be it for climate change or for equity and, racism awareness, and whatever I'm trying to do to, kind of help humanity along to be more human and more kind. It's always if I get people, capture people's attention through the beauty of the artwork, then perhaps they're going to be hooked into this awareness of conservation, of what they might do in their daily lives to make small changes, to lessen the loss, to slow the loss. Um, so there is definitely, I think being Irish, I've always got that, we have a natural inclination to embracing the exquisite beauty of the tragedy. But I think, yeah, that is built in there, but I, have the heart of the optimist. So I try and lead forward with the beauty and with the optimism, but having that hook in there of the awareness of climate change, and doing educational programming with all of my exhibitions. I really try and do that. I try and get like middle school girls interested in science and know that science is really cool and they can do science and art. So I try and take like a multifaceted kind of art education approach even when I have my exhibits, so that I can reach hopefully a broader audience. Les, do you know the reason why? Did you hear about how those tens of thousands of songbirds just literally fell from the sky around the time of the firestorms in California? And do you know why were they migrating and there was just thousands of deaths?
I remember seeing that, and it was one of those things that I saw while I had 5 minutes and didn't have time to investigate and never went
Okay.
back to it. So it could be a combination of things, right? Lack of food, if if the areas where they normally feed,
Hmm.
generally that doesn't lead to large groups like that.
Yeah.
But birds also have very sensitive respiratory systems, so it could have been something related to that. But I'd have to
Yeah.
dig in and kind of
Right.
see what.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like just on a civic level, I definitely, as I alluded to earlier in the talk, I have changed my whole garden into a pollinator garden. And oh my gosh, for the first time, warblers are coming to our little garden in the suburbs. It's so exciting. Like I have, kind of understory, like low, I don't know, they're like 5 foot to 4 foot, shrubs and even flowering, plants um, that I just kind of I guess my yard kind of looks a little wild. It looks like a painter gone awry, but the warblers are finally coming and it's really cool. And then, I'm also my next kind of foray into like, this is me continuing my education for climate change and just having more healthy bird species is caterpillars. I want to grow more caterpillars to feed more of the songbirds, the migratory birds, because I didn't realize that so many of them like caterpillars, right?
Yeah, the larvae, especially for nesting birds, are really important. If you look at what they're bringing to the young in the nest, most of the time it's some type of insect larvae
Yeah.
is going to be the primary
Yeah, so
food.
now I'm trying to plant different, species in the garden that will not only give the seeds, but also host the insects that the birds need. And this is my second year in changing to a pollinator and indigenous species garden. And in 2 years, then I've got warblers. I can't believe it. It's really cool.
Yeah, I know we got people with questions, but just to kind of to touch on that, one of the things that makes birds so interesting is how quickly their populations can respond compared to other species.
Yep.
And the fact that they are so visually a lot easier to study than things like insects, right?
Mhm.
They're larger, they're vocal, uh, they're easier to find, and so this idea that David brought up about the loss of
Yeah.
birds really was one of the leading factors that led to the establishment of the EPA
Yeah.
following Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. So they've always been used as kind of what we call an indicator group of
Yes.
species to
Yeah.
kind of identify there's something that's not right here. That's
Mhm.
probably affecting more than just the birds, but
That's right.
it's pretty easy to see in the birds given their nature and given how many people watch the birds just in their backyards for
That's
fun
right.
or uh, birding as a hobby is $1 billion industry. So
Yeah, it's like vulnerability and then resilience and strength. It's
yeah.
amazing.
So we've got 8 minutes left. I see we've got 2 hands raised, so I'm hoping to fit both of these hands into that 8 minutes. So Yvonne just has a little question, she says. But I see we'll go in order. So Judy had her hand up first. So Judy, please unmute.
I'll be really quick. First of all, with regard to the deaths of the birds, and this is a very new topic to me, I really know very little about any of this, as Les would know. But I did hear that it did have a little bit to do with smoke and the respiratory distress issue, but also confusion because of the visual being so different as a result of all of the smokiness. But my question, which I put in the chat because I wasn't sure that we'd have time for it, I guess is directed more to Les, but Deirdre, I don't even know why I came on this meeting other than the John and Les and Yvonne are friends of mine and I just missed them. So I wanted to see them. Crap load of work to do in another meeting in a few minutes, but I'm so glad I came on. Your work is absolutely, I don't know why it's affected me as much as it did, but I loved it and I'm so happy.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to see my friends. But I had written so Les, a question for you, but also something ironic about the fact that I just communicated with you this week for the first time in months. And I can't believe that it was related to, I forgot that this was the content of today's talk from your delightful presentations about art this whole semester. So my question to you, Les, and then a comment is, I was just looking outside at lunchtime, and as the leaves are, dropping, and I can see some trees far off that are very, very tall, I noticed what appear to be on the bare branches now some really high nests, I think really, really high. And as I was waiting for my coffee to brew, I was thinking that can't be safe. It might be better in terms of predators, but that just can't be good in terms of wind and heavy rains. I just can't imagine that being that high up is better than being lower, even though there's different risks. But, and yet they're there, and it's almost November, and those were probably, from many months ago, and I'm still seeing them. But so I wanted to ask you about the height issue, but then my comment, and Deirdre, this is almost, I was being a little bit sarcastic, but not really. I told Les, I think it was 2 days ago, Les, right? I feel like it was just recently. I had gone out back the other day, noticed some really low-lying branches that I did not realize had dropped, appeared to be too low for people to walk by if they needed to. So I was chopping them off, and one had an enormous nest under it, like hanging nest, like enormous. I have never seen anything like it. And I chopped the branch off, and then I grabbed the nest and I in a bag and moved it over to the woods. But I didn't take a photo of it. I wish I had. And I wrote to Les because I said, it may not have been a bird's nest. He actually thinks it was a wasp nest, and I'm really horribly allergic to bees and wasps and hornets. So it could have been a stupid thing to have done. I wasn't even thinking it was a hive. I was thinking it was an amazing nest. But I am so sorry I didn't take a photo because it was extraordinary. First of all, by its sheer size, but also I'm always marveling at how this is done, the sheer labor, and I even that it has wrappers in it, although this one didn't, but usually I see candy wrappers. I just find it amazing. Anyway, I just said to Les in the chat, I wonder what you would have done in terms of a painting of this massive, whatever the heck it was. It may not have even been a bird's nest, but it was something. It was something interesting. I still hope to get over to the woods to take a picture of it before it dissipates completely.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I found it ironic as well that.
Yeah, just this week.
Yeah.
Do you think it was a squirrel nest?
Probably not. That would probably fall apart pretty easy. The way she described it, it sounded like it was probably a wasp nest.
I don't know. I do have a lot of squirrels. Back there on the deck. I don't know.
Squirrel nests are so messy and would probably fall apart if you tried to.
No, this didn't fall apart.
Pick them up.
Yeah. But the being really high, Les, how fragile is that situation?
So with any evolutionary process, there were a couple of my students in here. We always talk about trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it's going to come down to for any of this is, yes, there's trade-offs associated with maybe more exposure to the weather, maybe more possibility of wind, but the benefit of escaping more predators is probably beneficial. Yeah. And right. So there was, Deirdre had a picture of that oriole nest, right? Orioles typically hang their nest at the end of branches because it reduces the number of predators that can walk on the branch and get to their nest, right? So everything in evolution has trade-offs. You're giving up one thing to get something else. So I always tell my students, right, there's no free lunch. And the same thing holds from an evolution standpoint.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great explanation. Thank you for that. And Yvonne, I'm sorry. You should have gone first, of course. Always. You should always go first, Yvonne.
Can I go then, John? Is that cool?
I was going to say, I think that means it's Yvonne's turn.
Hi, guys. Hi, Deirdre.
Hi.
Welcome. Thank you so much for coming and talking. I just wanted to take the opportunity to mention, as Les was saying, he and I have talked a lot about communication and how important that is. But I wanted to point out the difference between somebody that is just communicating data and somebody that's a fine artist. And I think that you showed us a really wonderful example of that and how you process the information and in the end, how you experience. It's about your experience. You're not just writing an article, right, about climate change. And so I think that you have such a fabulous balance in your work that really mitigates that line between what is communication and what is actually fine art. And so I just wanted to point that out to my students because I know that they're going to be doing projects around some of these ideas and that there is a difference and it has to come with self-expression and also, I mean, what Les was saying before too, which is really important, which is the emotion behind it.
Thank you. That is a really delicate balance, isn't it? I mean, we both look at those topics in our work. And I think it's like how to, there's the difference between like being doing medical illustrations, right, that are communicating these ideas and theories, versus creating artwork, and what is the difference? I mean, we're using, kind of to your point, John, like the same tools with, the elements and principles of design, but yet there's something in that synthesis that creates this other that has, and perhaps it's that emotive carrier. I mean, that's really important to me. I see that Dr. Jennifer Swan's on our Zoom call, and she was the lead on our on the neuroscience brain visualization class. Hi, Jennifer. I had an incredible summer working with co-teaching with Jennifer, and we had two students that were medical illustration students. They were actually doing medical illustrations of her neuroanatomy textbook that's going to be free and online. But and then we would do a fine arts component, right, Jennifer, where we would let them have total creative freedom and really respond emotively to neurons and ganglion cells and all this. And the outcome, I don't know, do you see the difference, Jennifer, between the medical illustration and then the art component? What is it?
It was really very interesting how they interpreted the work, and the artistic depth was great, but when I let them just do art, which they were like, please let us just do this, because the technical components kind of constrained them a lot. And I didn't realize that until we were well into the project. But the way that they did their art reflected a lot of the things but it took it in directions that I would never have thought of. That mobile that, what's her name made, of the little plastic pieces, they look like
yeah.
And then of course Sarah's little video at the end, which was very funny, but very, very good. Of the brain sections that she had, like hors d'oeuvres, all of that was amazing. And so
I'll share that with you, Yvonne. The students, we actually put together a virtual exhibition, and it's called Portraits of the Brain, Visualizing Behavior. So you can see and show your students like the medical illustrations, and then also their fine art, both their animation, their digital paintings, and their traditional paintings and drawings that work in both genre about the same content.
That's awesome. I would love to see that.
Definitely. And then working with Jennifer, I mean, that was, like I said in the beginning of the talk, it was really those neurons, those like neuron nests, that like just
Deirdre,
learning about the brain.
I'm in the psychology program, Deirdre. We can pull out all the psych students for that. You get brain,
Cool.
You get dendrites and axons going. We've got all the psych students at that session. Seriously, I would love to see that.
Okay.
But, the one thing that I did learn, and this is like a movement for me, because what I learned was that if you really want to illustrate something, get an artist to illustrate it. Like, hello. But the difference between my circle and stick approach to a concept and their actual drawing of it is like night and day. And why shouldn't it be? They're actually trained in art. I'm just pretending to do something. And the ability to get a really complex idea across it's fun. The difference, you have to share that with them, Deirdre, because the difference is amazing.
Yeah.
And then I'll say one last thing and then I will be gone. We were also able, and this is the beauty of having your textbook be online instead of a two-dimensional thing, we made things that moved and interacted and really got a concept across, as opposed to something that is flat and static.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a chemist and my chemistry grades are so poor. But what I keep thinking of is you could take, those two-dimensional figures where they have like an arrow, and so that things are here and then they're here and then they're like this, and you can do that. You can do a video of that, which gets the idea, and then you can rotate it. And this is the beauty of doing an online textbook, as opposed to the two-dimensional ones, which are just static. And when you see that, and you'll see that if shares everything, you'll see some of those things. You click on them and they move and they interact, and then you understand it as the way the scientist understands it, which is, this is a living, breathing, this is something that actually occurs.
Mm-hmm.
It's an idea that we've seen in process, and I learned so much from it. It was great. I absolutely recommend it. If you're doing anything scientific, get an artist. Get one. Thanks, Deirdre.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's great to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yes, it was wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
So I think we've run over just a little bit, but I want to try to shoehorn one more question in here. We have someone that's been very patient, so just one more question, and then we'll be off. But Adriana, you had your actual hand up. I'm wondering if you want to ask your question verbally, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Hi. I did have a question earlier, but I kind of changed my question. And I was wondering, do you consider yourself an activist? Because Yvonne, I don't know if you know a lot about her work, but we had a discussion about her sculptures a couple of weeks ago. And while they have a lot of environmentalist ties to it, or it's around the environment, it's not, it's more tied to the emotional connection as to from her family or her past history, and it's just tied to that. Do you do it as an activist, or do you think it comes from something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, well, I'm the daughter of a scientist, a hematologist oncologist. So that, like, I have that super awesome science nerd gene built in. And then the art gene that was just there from the beginning. So I think like, if I have to label myself, I just say I'm a painter. Like, I'm a painter. Pretty simple. Like, that's what I am. But I'm a humanist. I think or like, yes, I'm an activist. Absolutely. Like, it's, I just have, I think just as a human being and always wanting to evolve and try and be the best of all, just trying to better myself. Like, I have to be an activist. Like, I can't not do that, just ethically. Like, I must try and do the right thing, and help humankind. But like, so I don't really typically like label myself. So if somebody said, oh, am I like an environmental artist, I'd be like, well, I guess that would be like a subset under the title that I give myself. But for me, I'm a painter. But that idea of having something to say, right? And something to say could be, it could be, something just about beauty, because you know what? The world's pretty ugly right now and pretty scary. And actually putting something beautiful into the world, like, that's pretty awesome, because we kind of need that sweet spot as people right now. But maybe we need to have another little message in there. And that's what I was saying to my earlier point, where I try and attract with honey than with vinegar, and offer this kind of this respite of something beautiful to look at. But if you pause long enough, and if I do my job well enough, that would then entice you to look at my paintings long enough, perhaps might you ponder, why did she use that orange and black together? Those colors are kind of jarring. Those colors are kind of tumultuous. What does it make me feel? Oh, emotively, maybe I'm feeling, and then you can go into that. You, the viewer, can read that, and perhaps then we could, through the painting, have that activism, that kind of call for conservation or call for social justice, or we could have that conversation through the painting, and then you bring your story to it. I've brought you my story through the artwork, and therein is why art is so necessary in our world, because then we have this broader conversation, and so I guess my kind of activism, I try and have it be a little bit more ephemeral and a little bit more of a soft touch. Now, do I get out there to the marches and make my posters and do what I need to do on my block and in my community? Yes, I do that with my family and with my neighbors and friends. But with my art, I think that, it's maybe a little bit more like a haiku than like a kind of chant. Does that answer that?
Yes, it did. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
good question.
So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Les, for giving us
Thank you.
context on all of this and being part of the conversation. And thank you, Deirdre, for sharing your work with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And this has been amazing. And all of these talks have really been interesting in that we hate to close them out because there's so many continuing questions. And this one definitely has a lot of questions.
Well, you can send them to me and I'll answer them as best I can if you like.
Great. And I think it's great too, because it just shows like how powerful these conversations are, that they can continue into our lives after we've watched these or participated in these. So again, thank you everyone. And we'll close things out. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you attending.